Welcome back after that amazing 5-minute break. My name is Aaron. I'm one of the elders, and I'm also the director of operations around here. Just want to formally welcome you back. We are going to dive right into week 12 of our Ephesians series titled Brand New. And if you've been tracking along with us and you were here last week, we embarked on talking about the family context. And specifically, Pastor Ryan introduced us to the theme of submission in the context of marital relationships. That's a relationship between a husband and a wife. And we looked at he helped us see how submission is a willing choice to submit to the leadership of your husband if you're a wife, and that willing choice has the power to absolutely transform the dynamics of your marriage and transform the dynamics of your family. And then we looked at the responsibility of husbands in the context of marriage, and we looked at we zoomed in on how Jesus loves the church as a model for how husbands are called to love their wives and take care of their families. And so at the core of that, Jesus, he pays the ultimate price. He forfeits everything so that we can have everything. And ultimately, husbands, that's the tall order that we're called to live by, is being willing to put our wives and our families first as we seek to care for them and to introduce them to the person and work of Jesus. Today we're going to continue operating in the context of family. However, we're going to shift gears from talking about husbands and wives, and we're going to talk about a different topic with regards to family. And that, my friends, is parenting. So I got some parents in the house, I'm assuming. All right, good. I happen to be a parent myself. I have 5 young daughters that range in age from 1 all the way up through age 8. Please stop judging me. Thank you. I'm glad we clarified that. Really glad we clarified that. But to get us started, I want to bring you behind the scenes at the old 1024 Reese Road in the town of Severn, from which my wife and I hail. And during the past number of months, about 6 months or so, I've been working on putting the finishing touches on a graduate degree, and which I'm really thankful is coming to a head. I'll be hopefully graduating in December if everything stays the course. Yeah, good. Yeah. A lot of people are going to be clapping for that, especially the people that I live with, because during the last 6 months, these courses have come with inordinate amounts of reading, a lot of lecture time, so a lot of time spent in North Baltimore on campus, acquiring knowledge, they say. I'm not even convinced that all of it's knowledge, just throwing that out there. But I am thankful for the program that I'm in. But what that effectively has meant is, as a family, we have been under the gun, per se. There's been a real strain on us time-wise. So there are some weeks that are extremely hectic around my home, because if I'm not racing off to graduate school or meetings or just dealing with the day-to-day life as an employee at a local church, in addition to that, my wife is a night shift nurse. So every Friday, Saturday, I clock in, so I tap in at home, she taps out and heads up to work. So there's a whole lot going on. In any given week, I might come home at the close of the week feeling a little estranged from these people that I care about, namely my wife and kids. And truth be told, I am not the only one that is experiencing those types of feelings. And the reason I know that is because on a routine basis, I have some personal advisors that contribute to my life, and they tell me things. They call me to the carpet, and they tell me the truth about my life. And the people I'm referring to, they're about this tall. And they give tons of free advice. It's unsolicited. You don't have to ask for it. They dish it out by the snow shovel full. And at the end of any of these hectic weeks, I might hear things such as the raw truth that I care more about school or the meeting or work, that I care about those things more so than I care about my children. And I agree with them on some levels, but I disagree with them on a lot of levels. Because as I mentioned, my wife, she's a night shift nurse. So what that means for me is 2 days a week, 2 nights a week, like it's me and 5 little people. okay? So I get lots of FaceTime with my kids. It's not that I lack the opportunity to spend time with my kids, but life is a marathon. And so it's day to day, it's week to week, it's moment to moment, it's month to month. And on any given week that's hectic, where we really haven't had the FaceTime that our relationships demand, I get it, and I get it raw, and I get it heavy, and it sounds like, you love your stinking work more than you love us. And I'm just like, hold up, like throttle back. Let's talk about this. Let's reason together. But through the reasoning, I've established a personal routine for myself, and that's me asking myself reflective questions, because I do believe that my children are onto something. And the something that I think that they're onto is they're looking at my life and they're saying, Dad, there are things that you proclaim, that you believe, that sometimes it doesn't seem to be true if we're looking at the way that you're living. So they're analyzing the way that I spend my time, in a sense, and they're saying, it doesn't necessarily match what you say you believe. You tracking with me? Anybody else there? And the reality is that is a boat rocker. That is a boat rocker for me, because as a follower of Jesus, this thing called faith is supposed to produce a concerted effort or a concerted action. There should be tangible evidence of it. And in the context of parenting, I want to be sure that those core values I believe in, such as unconditional love, forgiveness, the value of spending time with the people that I love, I want to make sure that there's evidence that I do indeed care about those core values to the degree that I'm going to invest the time, the energy, and the effort that those core values demand. And so I can't disagree that there are weeks where it seems to be that I'm saying I believe one thing and I'm doing the polar opposite. I can't fail to realize that. But what I can do with those comments is I can say, all right, do I mean it when I say I love you? Am I backing the things that I say with practical actions? And that's the big question. Am I backing the things that I say with practical actions that are going to make the love that I say that I have for these people who are my children tangible and real, and something that they have open and free access to whenever they want to access it? And so here, before we get too far into this, I'm going to throw out on the table my biggest fear as a parent. And this is what it is. And it's not my ability to explain God's love to my children. It's not my ability to highlight theological truths or points of character that I think are worthwhile, or things such as integrity. It's not the things that I'm going to explicitly teach my kids that I'm scared of. It's the things that I'm going to implicitly teach them by way of my actions. It's the values that I'm going to impart on them through the way that I live my life. Because the way that I see it is, my actions are going to speak a message that sometimes is way more loud and way more clear than any of the words that I will ever communicate. Because ultimately, what I do communicates to an extent what I believe. And when it comes to parenting, I am convinced that I am supposed to provide an unconditional form of love, that I am supposed to help my kids come to the realization that they are only going to find true meaning and purpose in life through the person and work of Jesus. And in addition to that, it's also part of my role to help elicit what's best in them, meaning I'm trying to help them discover why God made them the way that they made them, trying to help them discover their passion, and help them to pursue and fulfill the calling that God has on each of their individual lives. I ultimately should be a safe haven for my kids. I should be a place where they can be completely and openly honest and truthful about how they feel. That might be emotionally, spiritually, the struggles that they're having, the questions that they have. They should feel safe in my presence to the degree that they can be open and honest, regardless of what they're being open and honest about, regardless of what the topic of those discussions might be. And so this morning, my goal is simply this. I just want to cast a vision for a style of parenting that I'm going to refer to as grace-centered or gospel-centered parenting. That's all I want to do. I want to cast some vision on that. Before I do that, I'm openly acknowledging that when we start zooming in on relationships that are as intimate as these, relationships between parents and children, that's it's very sensitive ground. And I would imagine that everyone in this room, when you hear the word parents, you're thinking of instances on which your parents really made you feel loved and accepted. Or maybe you're thinking of instances upon which your parents made you feel abandoned and isolated and unloved. I mean, I think there's a range of emotions that are elicited when we start talking about relationships between kids and parents. And then in addition to that, I want you to keep in mind that as I mention parent-child relationships, I'm referring to the relationship between people like myself, an adult man most of the time. I'm an adult. You're making stuff up about me right now. That's why you're laughing. Whatever. And small children, little human beings who are completely dependent on the way that we provide for them, the way that we guide them, the way that we coach them. But then in addition to that, I'm also thinking in terms of the relationship between an adult child and their parents. So a relationship between two adults. Still parent-child relationship, but the dynamics are different. The responsibilities are different. And so I want to really, really zoom in on it. It's my goal to zoom in on the way that God loves us as children and help us understand the degree to which God's love can transform the way that we behave, the way that we live, the way that we interact, and the way that God's love can transform the way that we parent our children and the way that we as adults interact with our adult children. So please know, I'm not interested in giving anybody prescriptions. So if you walk out of here with a punch list of things to do, please know that that's not my intent. That is not my goal. But it is my goal to help us better understand how much God loves us, how far God was willing to go to get us, to redeem us, and to call us His own. And so we'll be in Ephesians chapter 6, the first 4 verses. And if you open your Bibles, there you're going to find, "Children, obey your parents as you would the Lord, because this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may go well with you and that you may have a long life in the land. Fathers, don't stir up anger in your children, but bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord." So a cursory glance at this, like if we just take a quick look at it, it appears to be very specific. You got a couple of things that work. The first one is, kids, obey the big people in your homes who are your parents. And when I say parents, this might be single parent households. This might be mom and dad parent households. This might be a child who has a primary caregiver who's not their biological parent. It's children, obey the person that God has appointed to take care of you in a parental role. And it seems very point blank. And then the second half of that is Paul is saying, moms and dads, and I know it says fathers in the translation we're looking at, but Paul is implying moms and dads because it's a partnership. Parenting is a sharing of responsibility between mother and father. And so Paul is saying, moms and dads, do not engage with your kids in a way that exasperates them, that causes them to get angry and blow a gasket. Why are you laughing? We've never done that before, right? Oh, so we're all on the same page, because I thought maybe I was the only one. But now that I know that you're in the same boat, there's some different things that I might be able to say. But here's what we're going to do. We're going to bypass that part that we love, the part where it's like, children, obey your parents. Like, we love that part, I feel like. That's the easy one. You're like, all right, child, let me school you in the Lord. And you talk about the 5th commandment, and you get really excited when your kid starts reciting the 5th commandment, because then it's a point of reference. And you can say, you remember the 5th commandment? And you can kind of bring them back. But the reality is, as parents, The part of this that we need to hear is verse 4. It's the part about exasperating our children. And before I go too deep into what that means, I want to just throw this out there. There are things that we do as parents that cause our children to be unintentionally exasperated. Let me illustrate. Okay? I have 5 daughters who live in my home and call me dad because I indeed am their father and I love them. And as time goes by, I'm coming to the realization that I would do absolutely anything for them. If it meant laying down in traffic, whatever that means, I'm willing to do it. And routinely, I'm home alone with them, and I'm not hiding, although sometimes I'm like, I need to hide, because they're going to get me. And routinely they'll say things like, I need a dress, because not all of them are of age to reach the rack that's in their closet. And so I don't know why I do this anymore, but I still repeat the same mistake. I go to their closet, I open it up, and I grab, it's random selection, and it's kind of like eeny, meeny, miny. Whichever one I pick, they're going to say no, and I just pick one. And then they're like, no, that's not the one. And you're like, what do you mean it's not the one? This is a great dress. I love this dress. And they seem exasperated, but the reality is like that. I'm sorry, that is not on me. I made every effort. I politely heard the request. I walked quietly to the closet. I grabbed the dress and I handed it to the child, and I was met with rebuke. That's not the type of exasperation I'm talking about. I'm not talking about a failure at meeting some felt need that's just the invention of a human that's a lot smaller than us. It's not able to calculate the cost. What I'm talking about is something markedly different. And the point that I'm going to attempt to drive home for a majority of the time that we spend together today is simply this: that Jesus-centered parenting brings grace to life. At least it should. It should bring grace to life. It should make it a reality that everyone in the home is highly aware of, that everyone in the home is actively tapping into, that everyone in the home is responding to in particular ways. And the way that I want to highlight this is just tell you a little bit about a couple of paradigms with regards to parenting, defaults that I think we kind of gravitate toward in ways that we carry out our responsibility as parenting. But before I say that, just know that when Paul is saying what he's saying, he's inspired by God, and ultimately one of the themes that he's implicitly laying out for us is that our role as parents is not based on a power structure or an authority structure per se. It's based on sacrifice. It's us pursuing the best interests of our children and willing to eat last so that they can eat first. And the other thing that I believe Paul wants us to understand is we cannot get away from the fact that we are the primary influence on our children. And if you look at the way that human beings develop in the way that God has designed family, there's a period they're routinely considered the formative years. It's this period of growth, human development between like 0 to 5. During that time, our kids are learning a ton about life, a ton about relationships. Their personalities are being developed. Language is being developed. They're seeing us interact. They're beginning to respond to the way that we're caring for them or neglecting to care for them. And the reality is we are the primary influence. God has put us in a position to build a foundation for the future. And it's going to go one of two ways. If I'm thinking very broadly. And the one way is it's going to have a very positive outcome. Those bricks we lay at the foundation of our child's life are going to have very positive outcomes throughout life. Or we're laying bricks that are going to produce some negative outcomes as life progresses. You know, and some of this really hinges on, do our kids attach with us? You know, attachment is a huge thing that's taking place there. And that's basically, God has designed us for a relationship. He's hardwired little infants for a relationship with their primary caregivers, namely their mom and dad. And if that's something that goes well, then future outcomes seem to be pretty positive. If that's something that goes poorly, There are different challenges that we might face as human beings. But what Paul, I believe, two big types of parenting that we can imply, that are implied in this text, are going to help us understand a third manner of parenting that really Paul wants us to understand. And so the first one I'd like to talk about is called legalistic parenting. It's parenting that's steeped in legalism. It's steeped in rules. It's steeped in regulations. It's got lots of standards, lots of rails, lots of rungs on the ladder to climb, lots of things for kids to do, and it really hinges on this idea of compliance rather than relationship. And the target or the mission of a legalistic parent is getting their kid to comply with the rituals and the rites of the household. And the overarching message that emerges as parents embark on that type of parenting is, child, in this home, you have to earn your keep. You earn your place at the table. You earn our respect. You earn our love. And you earn our acceptance. Now, the tragedy there is that is about as far from the gospel as we can get, because God, despite us, is giving us a place at the table. God, despite us, is loving and accepting us fully and completely through the person and work of Jesus. So in a legalistic home, you have excessive and severe forms of discipline, nagging, condemnation. The margins for error are so microscopic that nobody can make a mistake and openly talk about it. And so what ends up happening is, like, deception becomes part of this mess in a legalistic home. Because if I'm a child in a legalistic home and I know that my mom and pop are going to blow a gasket if I tell them that, I brought home a C on my report card, or if I've even gone more off kilter than that, I've done something that's outside of the range of motion that those rules and regulations have defined, I'm coming home with a lie to tell, not a truth to share. And that's how I'm living my life. And if I'm willing to do that, if that's how I as a child would respond to legalistic parenting, the question becomes, and those are just my parents at that point, the question becomes, how do I respond to a God who has far higher moral and ethical standards than my parents will ever have or ever establish? The challenge, one of the other challenges with legalistic parents is they have a child that's always working on something. There's always some moral ground that they're trying to regain. And that seems to be a continuous highlight. And they justify the way that they interact with their kids by saying things like, well, little Johnny always, and little Johnny needs to, and that's why we treat him so sternly and so abrasively, and that's why our standards are so high. They build walls around themselves, and the way that they do that is they're always right and everyone else is always wrong. And the motivation is, ultimately they're trying to protect their child. And they're also trying to protect the image and the honor of the home. Because God forbid anybody find out what my kids are really doing with their time. And so a legalistic parent is relatively isolated from the people that could best help them. Because they build walls, because no one else has an answer as good as theirs when it comes to behavioral modification for their child or their children. And these households can be marked. They're not always marked by this, but it's keep people at arm's length. And there are certain things that will contaminate the home. Santa Claus might be one of those things. The Easter Bunny. They're terrified of anybody that doesn't meet the criteria, the moral criteria. And so you keep people at arm's length, and you shelter the kid, and your standards are so high that the child in that environment never really comes to grips with a reality of knowing whether or not their parents actually love them or love the way that they behave. And the running question is, do my parents really love and accept me? Or do they only love me when I behave a certain way? And if I'm remotely accurate in this, what you get from that in a Christian home that's marked by legalism is a gospel that's one-dimensional. It's a gospel that says, I'll love you as soon as you become lovely. I'll accept you as soon as you become acceptable. It's a gospel that says you have got to work your way to love and acceptance. As opposed to the gospel that we hear directly from Jesus that says, I fully love and accept you. There's a marked distinction there. Because the reality is, Jesus came to get people who couldn't comply. He came to non-compliant people, not to make them compliant, but to make them whole. And to fuel their lives, to fuel people into a new life to live like they otherwise couldn't live. But none of that was contingent upon our compliance or the lack thereof. It was all contingent upon and motivated by God's pure love of people who seem to be unlovely. And that's us. And a legalistic home just highlights our flaws. It highlights how broken we are. But it leaves us hopeless and wondering, are we going to make it? Can we make it? Is someone going to rescue us? And ultimately what's happening in a legalistic home is we're assigning value to things that really we ought not be assigning ultimate value to. We're assigning high value to rules and rituals as opposed to allowing God to define what's valuable. And God defines what's valuable as unconditional love is the most valuable thing that He offers us. And that is Himself. He's offering us Himself. But let me just camp out there for a second because I like to think of myself as non-legalistic. I would wager that I probably have legalistic tinges, but I do assign value to things. And the way that I want to lay this out is I want to talk about a couple of my own children, and I'm going to camp out on the older end of our age spectrum. So I'm going to talk about my 7-year-old, and I'm going to talk about my 8-year-old, and I'm going to talk about how we assign value. And my 8-year-old is she's highly athletic. We've always known this about her she was an early walker, an early runner, an early climber. She just had this drive to be outside, to climb on things, this drive for adventure per se. And she had an athletic bent. And the reason I'm happy about that is because I like athletics. I played baseball from the time that I was 5, played through college, had a great time. I love sport. I love competition. So when I found out that there was a potential of having an athlete in my home, I did 2 things. The first was I clapped really loudly. I said, that is amazing. I love that. And then I stepped back and said, please, God, don't let me try to live vicariously through this child's athletic ability because I will ruin this child. I will push her too hard, too fast, and I will ruin relationship for ritual. And so, as the clapping ensued, some other people in our vicinity, namely her siblings, start to respond. And their response is, you guys love athletics. I'm not very athletic. What about me? And at a certain point in time, my 8-year-old, we noticed that she was doing pull-ups and she would swing on this branch in our yard on a tree that I don't even really know how she got to the branch. Don't even ask. And don't tell my wife that I'm telling you this because she will freak out. But she's like swinging on this branch, doing pull-ups. And then at a certain point in time, she came to the realization that there's this thing called gymnastics. And in our home, it initially was called gymnasticking, and she was a gymnasticker. All right, so we're like, we love gymnasticers. We love the fact that you love gymnastics. And then the 7-year-old is like, hold up, I can't even hardly run. She's just not athletic, and it's not a slight against her. I'm not throwing rocks at her, but she is not athletic. She's just not bent in that way. Now, she is very intellectual. She's been reading for years. She will plow through chapter books like that's what God designed her to do. She writes stories under her own volition. I feel like she's already written more in her 7-year period of life than I have in my, that whole graduate program. I'm like, I don't even think I wrote that much, but whatever. Keep working hard. And so here's what happens. We like that too. And so we're like, that is amazing. Keep reading, keep writing. And the gymnasticker is deflated. because we're not clapping simultaneously for gymnastics and reading and writing. And so she's like, well, Dad, I think I'm going to pick up a new hobby. And you're like, oh, what is it? Reading and writing. And you're like, no, just do more pull-ups and master the back handspring or whatever you call it that makes me feel like I throw out my back every time I see it. The reality was we're saying, hey, no. God invented you. He made you. He designed you for a purpose. Let's pursue that purpose. And maybe it's gymnastics, but maybe it's something else. But we're saying don't try to shift gears and reinvent yourself. And we're not saying we value this more than we value that. But I can tell you this, sometimes the way that I act implies that I think some things are more important than others when it comes to skill set, when it comes to behavior. And granted, I do think that there are forms of behavior such as integrity that are more valuable than other forms of behavior. So don't get me wrong. I'm not arguing against morality here. I'm arguing in favor of making sure that at the end of the day, when you interact with another human being, namely your children, that they know without a shadow of a doubt that they are loved and accepted by you, that they have been given dignity, not by you yourself, but by God himself. And that's what you're upholding, is their human dignity. Their ultimate value, their ultimate worth is something that God has approved of. It's something that God is empowering us to reiterate as we parent our children. A legalistic approach doesn't do that. A legalistic approach, instead of breathing life into a child, it takes a toll on that child. It exhausts a child. It severs relationship. And ultimately, legalism breaks relationship. Because we can never live up to the performance standards. And I don't care who you are and what your performance standards are. You can't even live up to your own performance standards, let alone trying to get other people to live up to them. And the reality of the gospel is that we couldn't. And so Jesus did. That's about as simple as a gospel presentation as we can make. We could not, so Jesus did. And so ultimately, if I engage in parenting from a legalistic bent, I leave my kids feeling hopeless and ashamed and lonely. But that's not the only way that I can ruin things as far as my kids are concerned, and that I can engage in parenting in a way that's detrimental to their development and the way that they understand God. The other method that I feel like we default to, it's lackadaisical parenting. It's kind of like parenting without a real pointed purpose. That's parenting where it's like anything goes. You're not going to command your kid to do anything or avoid anything. You're not going to provide any real rails. You're not going to introduce them to theology or the concept of God, because you're into this idea of self-discovery. You don't want to thwart their development. You don't want to suppress ideas that maybe they have. And so you engage in this free-range style of parenting. And what I mean there is you're not legalistic at all, but you're not really giving your child the rails that they need. You're not giving your child the direction that they need from you as a parent that God has appointed to take care of them, to show them, to pave the way, to teach them how to live, to teach them the truth about God. Lackadaisical parenting can get into assigning value as well, but it just assigns value to everything. And one of the repercussions there is you kind of grow up and you feel like you need an applause at every bend in your life. You need someone to approve you. Your parents are always patting you on the back, regardless of whether or not what you're doing is meaningful or purposeful. And some people refer to this as like the every kid gets a trophy concept, which I'm sure we're relatively familiar with. But the thing is, that approach to parenting, it doesn't prepare us for the reality in which we live. It's not going to get my kids ready for a reality in which they're going to have to navigate. And I'm sorry, not everybody's going to pat them on the back. Not everybody's going to warmly welcome them. Not everybody's going to agree with them. Not everybody's going to be nice to them. I mean, that's the world in which we live. We're on this side of heaven. It's broken. It's a mess. We should expect messiness. But in addition to not just expecting it, we should also prepare our kids for messiness. Far be it from me to send my kids out into the world and their faces are melting off and their hair's blown off of their heads because they didn't realize that not everybody was as kind and nice as mom and pop. And so lackadaisical parenting, because of the lack of parameters, because of the lack of poise and purpose in the approach, it leaves kids frustrated and exasperated. A little different from the legalistic parent end, but both of these styles really converge in that they produce the same result: frustration, exasperation, resentment, bitterness. And what I believe Paul is really driving at is he's driving at a category of parenting that's other. It's a third category of parenting. And the reason I'm saying that is if we zoom in more closely on verse 4, what we're going to read is, fathers, don't stir up anger in your children, but bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. This is the aim of parenting. Paul is presenting us, inspired by God, with a third model of parenting that really hinges on us introducing our kids to the person and work of Jesus, the instruction of the Lord. And when we center parenting on the gospel, on what God has done for us, not what we're going to do for God, grace can become a reality in their lives. Unconditional love can become something that our children have access to and can tap into. This is a style of parenting that's going to allow you, regardless of the season you're in with your kids, to look them in the eye and say, child, I love you for the simple reason that you're my child. No strings attached. It's going to allow you to interpret failure and success through the lens of the gospel and say, you know what? My child's self-worth is not bound up in their success rate or their failure rate. Their identity and self-worth is fully established by God. This, to me, seems a lot less exhausting than being legalistic or lackadaisical. This is an answer to the question. This is an answer to the how do we do this thing? How do we get out of parenting alive? And I don't know about you guys, but parenting is challenging. All right? I have the privilege of watching 5 kids, all under 8, twice a week, alone. Do you know what that means? Do you know what that means? There are times when it seems like World War III is taking place in my living room. And I don't have an ally. I'm like, where's the help? And I'm saying that very candidly, but parenting, like it's hard. It's difficult. But God has called us to it because He wants to teach us something through it. And the type of parenting He's calling us to engage in has got to be steeped in grace. It's got to be steeped in the person and work of Jesus. It's a style of parenting that's going to give us clear parameters. It's going to allow us to adequately discipline our children, not for the purpose of correcting wrongs, but for the purpose of telling them through discipline, there is nothing that's going to hold me back from loving you, from taking care of you, from showing you what unconditional love looks like. It's a type of parenting that's going to allow you to say, I am willing to do whatever it takes to show you how much I love you. To show you that there is a God who's gone much further than I ever could have gone to rescue and restore people, to make people His own, to give people a seat at the table. Grace-centered parenting is going to allow you to put your child's best interests in the foreground and allow you to help pursue those things. Because grace-centered parenting says that somebody sacrificed everything so that I could have everything. So now I can be willing to give everything so that my kids can have everything. And I'm not talking about materialism. Please, somebody order me a roll-off dumpster. Because I'm trying to fill it, and I'm trying to call a number that the guy with the lift comes in and he's like, hey, that's all that stuff that was in your basement. And it's gone. I'm not talking about, that's not the everything I'm talking about. The everything I'm talking about is God Himself. When we approach our children with grace, we are preparing them to face reality. We're giving them the resources that they need to face the reality that exists, not the one that we invented or the one that we want to exist. I mean, and I'm with you. I want to keep my kids safe. I don't want anything bad to happen to them. But second to that, I want them to be prepared for a reality that's out there. I don't want them to be confused when they leave my home. I want them to be ready to follow Jesus at all costs, to love people at all costs, to engage in their work, to pour their lives into the calling that God has on their lives. And ultimately, when we approach parenting with grace at the center, with the gospel at the center, we're giving our kids the resources that they need to obey the command that Paul laid out. He laid it out in Colossians 3 verse 20 when he said, "Children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases God." We're giving our kids the resources to please God. And ultimately, at the end of the day, that's what matters. And so interesting thing when we think about Christianity, this is what Paul's doing here. He's engaging parents and he's engaging children. And this is what makes Christianity uniquely beautiful compared to any other religious system in the universe. And it's this, that Christianity assigns dignity and value to all human beings, despite race, despite age, despite whatever. Despite your background, your economic situation. And right here, this verse is applying human dignity and value to little children who culturally, during Paul's day, were at the disposal of their parents. If you were a Roman parent, you had full latitude to do whatever you wanted to do with your kids. Terrifying. But you had the latitude, and it was socially and culturally acceptable to off your kid if you just didn't want him anymore, to sell your kid into slavery. Paul is assigning a degree of value that no other system in the universe assigns to children. And here's where we're at in America. I recently was having a conversation with a woman. She's got 0 kids. She's tired of hearing the, "When are you going to have kids?" talk. And she's like, "When I'm ready, I'll have kids." But I'm really tired of hearing the "when am I going to have kids" talk. And I have 5 kids. And so I'm not hearing the "when are you going to have kids" talk. I'm hearing the "holy cow, that's a huge carbon footprint. Why do you have so many? When are you getting a trolley?" Like I routinely, and I'll go out with them because I'm a renegade and I'm a rebel at heart. And so I'll take them to places like Trader Joe's. And I am met with judgment because people are like, "Oh my gosh, that's a lot of kids." And you're like, "Wow, I had no idea. When I left, I didn't have any." By the way, you mind getting the door? Because my hands are kind of full. I mean, that's so what I'm saying here is in America, we don't nail it. We don't nail the value of children because we say they're valuable and they add something to a family. So if we see somebody without them, we're like, "Wow, we really wish you had some." But if we see somebody with too many, we're like, "Wow, you're crazy." So stop calling me crazy. Okay? Now, there is a third response to this, and this person is crazy. It's the person who comes up to me and says, "So when's number 6 coming?" That's the person that I ignore and run from because I don't know what they're doing or thinking, but they're on a whole nother wavelength. So Paul is validating children here. He's giving them value, and he's saying God has given them value. That's why he's giving them value. And so Paul, it appears as if he's talking to these little people that we are very fond of. They're the children that we have. But I think there's something bigger at work, and we can approach this from a broader perspective. Paul's talking about little children who are dependent on their parents for absolutely everything. But he's also talking about adult children who have transitioned out of their homes and are now interacting with their adult parents as peers. He's talking about that relationship as well. And Paul, although it says, "Children, obey your parents," he's not telling you, married man, married woman, to start consulting again with your parents and obeying them. Now, if you still live in your mother's basement, it is just do what she says, okay? But when you move out, different story. What Paul is getting at here is what we find in chapter 20 of Exodus, verse 12. And he says, what we read there is, "Honor your father and your mother so that you may have a long life in the land that your Lord God is giving you." And so let's make a distinction here. Adult children, which is most of us, that's why we're going this route. Adult children are not called to obey their parents. They're called to honor their parents. And in honoring your parents, That doesn't mean you have to show admiration or affection for your parents. It doesn't mean that you have to trust your parents. But you do have to honor them. And the reason is simple. In honoring your parents, regardless of what they've done to you, regardless of how they've failed you, regardless of how they've let you down or abused you or abandoned you, you're called to honor them because it honors God. And I know that's a very sensitive subject when you start talking about what happened to some of us in our childhood. So what I want to say before I say anything else is this. I'm going to lay out some things that you can do to honor your parents. And some of those are things that maybe you take and you run with them. Maybe you do those things. But some of them, please don't do them because it probably wouldn't be healthy for your relationship with your parents to do them. Some of our parents, they're not trustworthy. They're not admirable. And so trusting them today because you heard a sermon is not the next step you should take. There's something bigger that needs to happen before you even get there. Admiring your parents could be unhealthy. What Paul is saying is it's okay to be honest about what happened to you. It's okay to be honest about your childhood. It's okay to reconcile that through the lens of the gospel. It's okay to tell the truth about what happened in the past. And the big question is why? And why we do that is not because of anything other than the fact that it honors God when we honor our parents. And so since we're called to honor our parents, let's talk about some real practical ways that we can do that. And again, these are not suggestions for everyone. This is a prime week, an opportunity that maybe you have to honor your parents. You're going to feast. Those of you who are celebrating Thanksgiving, give your parents a place of honor at the table. Serve them first, regardless of what they've done. Pull out all the stops. Just be nice to your mom and dad if they're coming over to your house. And again, if that's an appropriate thing for you to do. If they're coming over to your house is the key word there. Give them a place of honor at the table. Another thing you can do is just communicate with your parents on a regular basis. Call them, interact with them, bring them up to speed with what's going on in your life. Again, if this is a safe thing for you to do. Ask them for advice and then don't take it. Green light. There's freedom in the house of God. I'm serious. Call them and say, should we do it? And when they say yes, say, okay, thanks. We're never doing that. Just so you know, everybody in my home. They need to see life through you. That's what they've been doing. Like they literally had been doing that as you were a child. They saw life through your accomplishments, through your failures. And so they need to continue to see aspects of life through you. So bring them in. Welcome them at the table. Honor them. Communicate with them. Treat them with dignity and respect. Even if you, I don't know if I should go there or not. My parents are here. I don't know what they're thinking. But what I love about my mom and pop, and they're here, is I feel like we have an ongoing, open, honest dialogue where I could call them or talk to them today and say, you remember that time? And we could have an honest conversation about it. And I think my dad would be very defensive because he's just hardcore. But he's got a soft heart. But we can have an honest and open dialogue about the truth or the reality, our perceptions of how my childhood went, how my adolescence went. And sometimes, it's not me telling them how they failed. It's them being like, I have an aneurysm because of you. I almost died 4 times because whatever it might be. Because I was the golden child. But what I'm getting at here is there is an aspect of grace at work in those dialogues. You remove that, we can't be honest with each other because what do we do with failure? What do we do with letdown? What do we do with the way in which we've harmed each other without the gospel? And here's the reality that some of us, we've grown up physically, and meaning that we've moved out and we're now adulting. We have jobs, we make money, we make moves. But psychologically, we never moved out. Psychologically, we are still seeking the approval of our parents. And Paul's not saying, seek the approval and acceptance of your parents. He's saying honor them. He's not saying find ultimate worth and purpose in your parents. He's saying honor them. But unfortunately, some of us still struggle with, we just want to know that our mom and dad love us, they accept us, and they approve of who we are. We want them to pat us on the back and tell us that we're worth it, that we're worthy. Some of us are still that little boy or that little girl that just want to hear a simple I love you, that want a simple hug, that want simple affirmation of self-worth. And for some of us that's never happened, and for some of us that may never happen. And because that's either never happened or is never going to happen, we're left feeling bitter, resentful, we're cold, we're indifferent. And that's fueled us to try to pursue success in our careers or other relationships or what have you. And we're really just driven in that regard because we want to make that phone call and say, Dad, you know what? I did it. Because we're seeking ultimate approval from our parents. We want them to tell us that we're valuable. And so here's where I'm going with this. If your parents have hurt you, if your parents have made mistakes, the best way that you can honor them is not by giving them a place at the table or pretending about your past. The best way you can honor them is by forgiving them. That is the play that you have to honor your parents. That is the card that you have to play, regardless of your circumstances, regardless of how your parents succeeded or failed. You have the card of forgiveness to play. Because the reality is this, we have been greatly forgiven. We missed the mark. We failed as dismally as the person standing next to us. Without forgiveness, we've got nothing. So I'm encouraging you, forgive your parents. Openly and honestly reconcile your past through the lens of the gospel and forgive your parents. Because the order was tall for them and it's tall for us. The good thing here is, church, not one of us is going to be measured by our caliber of parenting. We are measured by the person and finished work of Jesus. There is nothing your parenting can add to that or take away from that. Now, I will say this, our parenting should be fueled by that. We can't add to what God has already fully secured. We can't take away from what God has completely secured, but we can live from that. And that's what Paul wants us to understand. Ultimately, we need to understand this big idea that God is our ultimate Father and that God always parents us. He always treats us. He always interacts with us with grace. Grace is what drives God's interactions with human beings. And we see a very clear picture of this in Luke chapter 15. This is a familiar story in the Christian world, and that story we know as the story of the prodigal son. If you've read the Gospels, you've probably run into this story. And as the worship team comes back up, I want to just draw out this picture of God as the ultimate Father and this picture of Jesus as the ultimate Son. So in Luke chapter 15, we learn of a story of a father and a son. And when you start looking at the details and the dynamics of that relationship, we can only assume it's relatively broken. We don't know why, but we do know that the son has some issues because he's basically saying to his father who's still living, he's saying, Dad, I want the inheritance now. And by way of implication, he's saying, Dad, it'd be better if you weren't around so that I could reap the material benefit of your death. And he's saying, Dad, why don't you just give it to me now? Completely humiliating if you're a father. That would enrage me, if I'm being honest. I would be disappointed, deeply disappointed. But we don't read about the disappointment in the text. What we read is that the father says, okay, son, here you go. He gives him the inheritance, and he watches as his son, his flesh and blood, leaves town on a plight to find himself. And he runs around town. He exhausts financial resources to the point where he's not just financially bankrupt, he's spiritually bankrupt, he's emotionally bankrupt. He's run from everything that he had in pursuit of something that he thought he needed. It's to the point where he takes a job feeding animals, and he's not just feeding the animals, he ends up sustaining himself with the slop that he's throwing into this pig trough. He's consuming food made for a pig. He's hit rock bottom socially, morally, spiritually, even physically at this point. And he comes to the conclusion, it would be better to go back to my father's house and be a slave. So there's something to be said about the way that this father loves people. Because even slaves feel loved by him. Even slaves feel accepted. Even slaves have a place at the table in this father's house. And so he goes home. He decides to go home. And on his way home, he comes to the conclusion that he's got some reconciling to do. And before he can even reconcile, his father sees him at the city gate, the public square. Now granted, everyone in town would have known about this because word traveled fast. And what this son did to his father, he humiliated him in the way that he demanded his inheritance and he ran from home. The father puts his reputation on the line to express a deep, unconditional love for his son, and he makes haste and he embraces his son. And he hugs him and he brings him home. He welcomes him. He slaughters the fatted calf. He finds the nicest clothes that he can find and jewels, and he vests his son in something new. And now this is a picture of God. Now God, unlike the father in the story, God is the ultimate father. God holds our inheritance. Jesus is the ultimate son. Jesus brings forth our inheritance. He makes it accessible and available to us. And the thing about Jesus is, unlike us, that fifth commandment, it stands in our way. That whole honor your mother and father thing, we failed. Jesus, the ultimate son, did not fail. He came and he fully honored the Father as the ultimate son. He lived a perfect life. He died a death that we deserved. He cleaned up the mess that we made. And one of the things that demanded of Jesus is that Jesus give up the love of the ultimate Father. When Jesus is hanging on a cross crying out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" He is forfeiting the love of the Father in that instance so that we can have open and free access to the love of the Father. That is the gospel. That is the good news. That Jesus, the ultimate Son, paid the ultimate price so that we could have a right relationship with the ultimate Father. And through parenting, as we navigate the ins and outs and the ups and the downs, the challenges and the successes, God is telling us, never forget the gospel. Let it be at the center of every interaction that you have with your kids, with your adult parents. Let grace and forgiveness drive the way that you interact with your kids, and that we as adult parents interact with our parents. The reality is this: we couldn't complete the fifth commandment on our best day, under all the right circumstances. Jesus, the ultimate Son, paid the ultimate price, forfeited the love of the ultimate Father, so that we could have open and free access to the love of the ultimate Father. That's all I have.